Welcome. Our time is called The Story Matters. And you might ask, whose story matters? Well, your story matters. And everyone's story matters. And today we have a remarkable storyteller to share with us in a conversation. Dr. Jack Mayer, who is a pediatrician and Rainbow Pediatrician.
Pediatrics,
Yeah. And he's also a writer and many other things. So, Jack, we welcome you here, and maybe you can tell those who are watching about yourself.
Well, thanks for inviting me. I'm delighted to know that this program exists to share the whole wondrous concept of storytelling, which is so important. Just by way of some background for my history, I'm a pediatrician here in town at Rainbow Pediatrics. I've been a pediatrician for more than 40 years now. My first practice was up in Enosburg Falls and Richford, Vermont, which is in eastern Franklin County, right on the Canadian border. And I was a solo pediatrician up there for 10 years, often bartering my services for eggs and firewood and knitted Afghans, and it was a very interesting practice. And then I came down here, moved here in 1987, then spent 4 years in academic medicine at Columbia University at the School of Public Health, where I was doing research in childhood cancer. And then returned to Middlebury in 1991 to start Rainbow Pediatrics, and have been a pediatrician since then. Throughout my career, I have been fascinated by people's stories, and one of the benefits of being a physician is that you get to hear a lot of stories every day. And one of my literary heroes is William Carlos Williams, the pediatrician who was also a poet and a writer in the early part of the 20th century, and he sort of has inspired me to be very thoughtful about what I'm hearing from my patients and what about their lives, and the quiet heroism that goes on all the time that we don't ever hear about or know about. But there's that famous quote: "Be kind. Everybody you meet is carrying a heavy burden," and it is true. And the heroism that people bring to those burdens is inspiring as a writer. So it's something I've always written, mostly poetry and fiction and some essays about my practice, and I also write about hiking the Long Trail in Vermont. I'm an avid hiker. My son and I hike the Long Trail every year, and when I go hiking alone, I write a poem on every hike, and I leave that poem at the shelter in the shelter books. And for those of you who are familiar with hiking the Long Trail, nobody has their own name on the Long Trail. You have a trail name, and so you take on a new identity. My trail name is Mountain Poet, and that's the name when I leave my poems at the shelter, they're always under the name of Mountain Poet. So I have a collection of those poems. And then I sort of fell into this project of writing Life in a Jar, which has been sort of a remarkable turning point in my writing career.
Can you tell us how you did fall into that process?
It was really serendipitous. I'm a German Jew. I was born after the war. My parents narrowly escaped the Holocaust. Some of my family did not. When I was a child, I grew up in the Washington Heights section of New York City in Manhattan, and it was an area of Manhattan where the German Jewish survivors of the Holocaust settled. I didn't speak English until I was 5 years old. This area of New York was a completely German shtetl, really. It was settled by all. I mean, everybody spoke German. The butcher was German. The dairy, the fish market, every place there was a German newspaper. We lived with my grandmother, who never spoke English, and so it wasn't until I started school that I began to speak English. So the Holocaust was something that was always present in my life in a sort of an unspoken way. I lived with people who were traumatized by the Holocaust. There was a silence about the Holocaust, a disturbing silence, an awkward silence, and a gracelessness about the Holocaust that I grew up with. But it was also the iconic story of my childhood. So weighs heavily in my life. So with that background, I'm a member of the U.S. Holocaust Memorial Museum, and every year I send them my dues. They send me a calendar. And so in the year of 2001, I got this calendar, which was the 2002 calendar for the Holocaust Museum. And I get this in my office. I get a ton of mail every day. Every item of mail has about 3 seconds to either be relegated to the recycling pile or read or filed, or So I quickly thumbed through this calendar, and I came on to this page, and this is it's Irena Sendlerova. And what stopped me was that this photograph of her as a 29-year-old, Irena Sendler, she looks like my niece. And so I stopped and I quickly read this little paragraph they had here. And it said that she had rescued 2,500 Jewish children from the Warsaw Ghetto. And I said, what? Who? Irena Sendler? I never heard of her. Everybody knows Oskar Schindler. He rescued 1,100 Jews from a German concentration camp in Poland. Why don't I know her? So I kept this. I put it. I have a file in my office that's labeled "Interesting Stuff," and that's where I put it. And that's where it sat for 3 years. And then in February of 2004, I came into my office one night to see a child, and on my desk was open a copy of the Ladies' Home Journal, and it's open to an article about 3 Kansas teenagers who had discovered the forgotten story of Irena Sendler and had written a play about how she rescued children from the Warsaw Ghetto for a National History Day project that they were doing. After National History Day, which was 2001, which was what inspired this entry in the Holocaust Museum calendar, they continued to put on this play because they had discovered that Irena Sendler was still alive. They thought she was dead. Some philanthropists in Kansas City raised money for these kids to go visit Irena Sendler in Poland, in Warsaw. And in 2001, they visited with her and began this remarkable 8-year relationship with her in the last 8 years of her life. When I saw this article from the Ladies' Home Journal on my desk, which I have no idea who had put it there for me to see, I called their teacher, Norm Kennard, just to ask him for some information. I just found this remarkable, and I remembered this item. And when I called him, he said, it's interesting you should call because we're looking for someone to write the story, these 2 stories, the interwoven stories of Irena Sendler and her wartime heroics and how she organized this rescue network, and the Kansas teenagers and how they came to rescue the rescuer, is the term they used. So I agreed. I went out to Kansas in November of 2004 to meet them. And it was one of the most remarkable journeys I've ever taken. These girls came from a high school in southeast Kansas, in Uniontown, Kansas, which is a town of 288 people. There's 120 students in this high school. It is one of the lowest income school districts in Kansas. It's a school district where there's never been a Jew, where there's never been a person of color, where there was never a Catholic. So it's really not a diverse student population at all. And here are these 3 teenagers, two 14-year-olds and a 16-year-old, who have told the story of this rescuer and have changed history, have really cracked open the silence about the Holocaust in Poland with their efforts. Because when they went to Poland to meet Irena, it was a national story in Poland and has continued to be so. And they have turned this forgotten Holocaust hero into a Polish national hero. And they have really been part of stimulating this renewed Polish-Jewish dialogue in Poland that has really, as I said, cracked open the silence about the Holocaust that it was so prevalent. So it was, and it took me 6 years to write the book because I was also being a pediatrician at the same time. But I spent many hours on research and interviewing the girls and Norm, their teacher, other survivors, other children who Irena had rescued who are now in their 60s and 70s. I went to Poland with them in 2005 to meet Irena and to interview her, which was the most remarkable thing I've ever done. And every time the girls go to Poland, and they've been many times, and they continue to go now, and here we are 16 years later since this project has begun, they put their play on in various venues throughout Poland. So they're continuing to tell Irena's story in this very dramatic fashion.
So this has become really their life story in many ways.
Absolutely has.
Yeah.
And the interesting part, and what's not in the book, of interest to readers who have read the book and don't know the follow-up, these three girls, what's also remarkable is the arc of development of the character of each of these three girls. Each of these girls carries some painful burden about their mother, and they're telling this story about Irena Sendler and her network of rescuers who asked mothers to give up their children. So Liz, who started this project, was abandoned by her parents when she was a child and was brought up by her grandparents. She's an angry young teenager who is the kid you would expect not to graduate from high school, let alone go on to do something like this. Because of this project, her life has completely changed. She's now gotten her second master's degree. Her first was in education, her second one is in history, and she teaches Holocaust education now to middle school students in Missouri. Megan, whose mother was diagnosed with breast cancer and who loses her mother during this project, is now the program director for the Life in a Jar Foundation in Kansas that works with high school students. They're a nonprofit foundation that work with high school students from every state in the United States and from 35 or 40 countries to do projects about unsung heroes in history that are based on the Irena Sendler project. And finally Sabrina, who also lost her mother quite suddenly at a young age, who is now she's an early childhood educator and a teacher.
That's remarkable. That's really so 16 years. It's helped to shape. Have you gotten responses from other people who read the book that you might want to share? A little bit. It's a book that I self-published this book, and it goes from person to person, which for me is very gratifying as an author to know that it has spread in that way. It's kind of like a benign infectious disease that goes from person to person. And so the responses I get from individuals are completely heartening. I mean, I've got about 430 reviews on Amazon. It has a 5-star Amazon review. The book has gotten 9 book awards. It's translated into 3 languages. The audiobook came out this year. And so and then the letters and the cards that I get from people who've read and been touched by the book are really quite remarkable, and mostly they have to do with
having been inspired by this story, you know, one of the things about Holocaust stories, and one of the things that compelled me about this particular story, is that I think all stories and testimonies and witnessing of experiences from the Holocaust are important, and they need to be archived, and they need to be written down, and they need to be told. Many of those stories, when I read them, leave me angry, depressed, vengeful. You know, a lot of very powerful negative emotions are stirred up by those stories. What compelled me about this story is that it's a story of inspiration, because it's, first of all, it's a story of rescue. It's a story of goodness in one of the darkest times of history. It's a story of courage. Both Irena's courage and the courage of these three girls to do this story and to pursue it and to continue pursuing it, and the courage of these girls to let me tell their personal stories, which are each quite painful and quite, and they, to their credit, all of them, when they reviewed the manuscript, they said, go ahead, tell my story, leave the names, leave everything as it is. But it's also a story of the power of one person to change the world, and the power of a teenager, of a high school student, to change the world. So a lot of students who read this, and a lot of times, and I give talks about the book at high schools and middle schools, it's what I really emphasize, and what people write to me about when they've read the book, is that very few of us would be like Irena Sendler and do what she did. She put her life on the line and her family's life on the line every day for several years. I think very few of us have that kind of courage. But all of us could do what these three girls did and change the world by some act of repair. And that's what I consider every sort of act of goodness and decency, and something that enhances tolerance and respect for all people, is an act of repair in a world that is broken and much in need of repair. So that what I hear from people, and what my hope was in writing this book, was that it would inspire other young people to do what they can. Everybody can do something, and the greatest fault is to do nothing. There's a wonderful quote by a Hebrew sage, Rabbi Tarfon, from the 1st century A.D., and it goes, "It is not for us to finish the task, but neither are we free to desist from it." So we all have to do something, and I think that's how the world changes for the better.
Yeah, and the book continues to be finding new audiences.
It's remarkable. I mean, it came out in 2011. It's 70,000 copies have been sold in one form or another. It's at bookstores. It's on Amazon. It's on Barnes and Noble, Kindle, Nook, iBook, now an audiobook. So it's a resonant story. It's a story that resonates with people, and particularly resonates with young people, with teenagers.
And college, is it high school that mainly, or college?
I think college, and it's for a general adult. I mean, I think I generally suggest that by the 8th grade, most kids are able. Kids can read this book if they've had some background in the Holocaust, in the history of the Holocaust. It's, you know, many of my readers are adults, and I would say I give more talks to adult audiences than to school audiences.
So, where has that taken you with your new book?
Well, my new book actually is my old book.
Oh, okay.
So, I mean, this is a book I started 23 years ago in 1992. And I was, I heard this story at a Yom Kippur sermon at Middlebury College in 1992. It's a story of a young fascist assassin who participates in the assassination in 1922 of the highest-ranking Jew in the Weimar Republic, Walter Rathenau.
Mm-hmm.
And it's the story of the arc of his redemption and how he goes from being an early, a proto-fascist, proto-Nazi assassin, and how he redeems that. And the fulcrum of that redemption is a letter that the assassinated minister's mother has read in open court when this young man is sentenced, where she offers her forgiveness to him, and the conditions of her forgiveness are that he confess before an earthly judge and repent before the court of heaven.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
And the name of the book is Before the Court of Heaven.
Yeah, and that's also the theme of repair.
Of repair, absolutely.
Which is a very important Hebrew and Jewish perspective.
Yes.
Healing the world.
Exactly. Tikkun olam is the Hebrew expression. That's to repair the world. Yeah. Yes.
So now, how does that? How has that impacted your poetry? I mean, you started in poetry, I think, before you went to these books. And how has it influenced what you do in poetry?
Well, it's an interesting. You know, I'm an undisciplined writer.
Okay.
I have not gone to an
If
MFA.
you're an undisciplined writer, I'm a terrible undisciplined writer.
I've been a participant in the Bread Loaf Writers Conference 3 times, twice for fiction and once for poetry. But I'm not a literary writer. I don't have any pretensions to being quote unquote literary. I'm not quite exactly sure what that means, but and I think my poetry is really very much the same. I think of myself as sort of a Grandma Moses when it comes to poetry.
Interesting image.
So and in writing Life in a Jar, which is nonfiction, it was a real challenge for me because, nonfiction is the truth, and fiction is the mirror we hold up to the truth. So in a way, writing Life in a Jar was a real challenge for me because my background is or my preference, my instinct as a writer is for fiction and poetry, which comes in some mysterious fashion. So it was, in some sense, a relief to get back to, Before the Court of Heaven is historical fiction. It's based on a true story, but nobody really knows kind of what how this fellow ended up. The end of his story is still is murky. So that part has become fiction. So it adheres to a nonfiction beginning, but then is definitely fiction. It's a novel. So I definitely felt more at home than coming back to the fiction genre.
And well, you have a range of interest in poetry that goes. Because I remember the other day in the session we were in together, I admired the poems that you selected to start that.
And Mary Oliver is one of my favorite poets because
absolutely.
She also, to me, is a very down-to-earth poet who communicates in images that are so readily accessible for a reader, and that's really what I aim for. What I aspire to is that the images that are conjured up in my brain are then easily accessible.
Do your poems become stories? Do they take on the characteristic stories, or are they something different?
That's an interesting question. I think that perhaps they are ultra short stories, and that each poem has its own very brief narrative arc. They're like meteorites.
Right. That's a good image.
A brief flash, and there's a nugget of story in each of them that that somehow comes to me.
Maybe you could say a little bit about the image, Life in a Jar. For folks who may not have read the book yet, it's an enticing title.
It's the title that the teenage girls came up with when they wrote the play, because Irena's rescue network kept lists of all the children that they rescued. The hope being that they would then be able to reunite them with their parents or with their relatives after the war, and because each child had forged documents and had a new name, so that each Jewish child was given a Polish name. So the lists contained their Jewish name and their Polish name, and Irena was very insistent that these children know their real name and that they know that they were Jewish. So she kept these lists, and the lists were put in jars that she and a co-conspirator buried under an apple tree in the backyard of her co-conspirator's house. And so that's where the title "Life in a Jar" comes from.
That's a powerful image.
Powerful image, and I have visited that tree. The tree is still there. It's a small apple tree,
Right.
And in the backyard. And the daughter of this co-conspirator still lives in the house.
Okay. We're running close to time, so are there last things that you'd like to kind of share about your thoughts and reflections on your books, on storytelling that
Well, I guess I think maybe, because we're in this particular time of sort of fear, and where fear and courage are in conflict, seem to be in conflict with each other. One of the things that, when I talked to Irena Sendler, when I interviewed her, I asked her if she wasn't about her being afraid of what she was doing, because she was risking her life every day. And she said, yes, she was afraid, but it didn't deter her from acting. It didn't deter her from doing what she knew was the right thing to do, the decent thing to do. Which was to rescue these children. And I think there's a message in there for us today, in a time of fear, that we must not let fear deter us from doing the courageous and correct thing in our lives, and that fear is the handmaiden of courage, and that if you're not scared, it isn't courage.
That's a good way for us to end and say thank you for you coming and sharing this time, and we're grateful.
Thank you. I enjoyed this.